Excuse me. Isaiah chapter 14. And we had gotten down to verse 18 in our study, but this section begins back in verse 12 and goes through verse 20, that I titled, at least, Babylon's Pride is the Reason for Her Fall. And for the 10 millionth time, Lucifer is not Satan. That's just for Jason's benefit. But it does set forth the king of Babylon and his exalting himself, his pride, and God is going to bring him down, as verse 15 says, to the Sheol, or to the pit. And verse 16, people are going to look upon him and say, this is kind of derision, that this is a man who made the earth to tremble, that shook kingdoms. In other words, people were afraid of him, and look at him now. He made the world, verse 17, as a wilderness, destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners. So it has been presenting that here's the king of Babylon. He's been brought down low, even to Sheol. He is, the world's looking on his dead corpse now with ridicule and derision. So that brings us to verse 18, that all the kings of the nation, even all of them, lie in glory, every one in his own house. This is a general statement. It is not an absolute statement. When it says all the kings of the earth, does that mean every single one of them, without exception? Well, if you read back through the Bible a little bit, you'll find that there are plenty of exceptions to this. He uses all in a generic way. We do it all the time. What does that all mean every time we speak? No. That's the whole point of using it in that case. Sometimes preachers and others are accused of using words just like Isaiah uses all here. That you use a general statement in relationship to a lot of, or maybe the majority of, and you say all, and someone challenges that. I know so-and-so, I know this. Well, I didn't mean every single individual, neither did Isaiah. It is a general statement.
You learn that as a child, you say everybody's doing it.
Usually everybody's doing it means there's one, maybe two people, then you want to do it too. Or if it's a complaint to the elders, well, everybody's, who? Well, me, my wife, my children.
That's what I started doing. When somebody says everybody's saying this, I said, well, let's go through the directory.
Yeah, it's generally that person and his wife or her husband or children, and that's usually about it. So we shouldn't, though, be disturbed by statements like unto this that are general in nature. Now then, basically he is saying that all other kings died in peace. Again, did all other kings die in peace? Obviously not, but it's a general statement. And they lie in glory. In other words, they had an honorable burial and were lying in what we might call a grand mausoleum. Who is it? Lenin in Russia that has that? And they keep preserving his body. Well, that's basically what he's saying here about all the kings. Everyone in his own house would be his own sepulcher, his burial place or tomb. Makes you think of the pharaohs and the pyramids. Pyramids were basically tombs that the king would be buried in. And then they would have other compartments in it for those who would attend to the king. But that's just a large sepulcher in that case. So he's saying here's all of the other kings of the world, all of the kings of the nations, and they've died in peace. They had an honorable burial. They're lying in their own sepulcher. That, as he puts it, everyone in his own house. In other words, they prepared it for themselves. But, verse 19, thou art cast out in thy grave like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that were slain, thrust through with a sword, they go down to the stones of the pit as a carcass trodden underfoot, or under feet.
Is that term pit, go down to the stones of the pit, is that the same, would that be the same pit that's used in Ezekiel 32 and Job 33 and all over the Bible, pits in the dog's Bible, but the same pit? In other words, the extension of Sheol after the final judgment, what that would be?
I don't know. That's a good thing for you to study for next week. Well, we've got a good library that can help you out on that. It is not Sheol, so it's a different word. It's bore. And it is used in various ways. So it's used as a cistern, for example, and many other ways. So does that give enough of an answer to you on that? So while verse 18 presents, here's all of the kings of the nations, thou, talking about the king of Babylon, did not have a normal burial. He was simply cast out basically onto the ground without a grave. And he uses a figure of like a branch, a worthless branch that would be cut off and just thrown out to the side, cast away. So that's the way the king of Babylon would be buried. That's not really a burial, though, is it? Then he uses another figure, like clothing that would be thrown away because they're soaked in blood. Because the person wearing that clothing had been thrust through with a sword. So blood just all over the clothing. That clothing is good for nothing but to be thrown away. That's the king of Babylon's body now. Just thrown away, likened to that raiment. And their carcass trodden under feet. So, in a battle likened to the battles at that time, the corpses were not buried on fields of battle. They were just left there to basically decay. Didn't have the ability to bury all of them, for one thing. Didn't take the time nor the effort. And they did not have that type of respect for the physical body that sometimes we demonstrate within our lives, even though the body just a corpse now without the spirit. We, at least in our society, have still a respect for that body. They didn't demonstrate that type of respect. And so here's a dead corpse laying from the field of battle. Why should anybody go and bury it? It was just left there to decay. Well, that's why he's saying, like the king of Babylon, he's going to be a corpse that's laying there and not even buried. Now then, again, keep the contrast in mind from the previous verses, starting in verse 14, how he has elevated himself and his greatness, and he's thinking he's basically likened to God. And the contrast that's presented in those verses and what Isaiah is presenting is going to be the result of him. So in verse 20, thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. So those individuals who died with the king, that would basically be the princes and all of those individuals that would be associated with the king. Well, they're not going to be buried either. Just like the king's not going to be, they're going to be there left to rot as well, without any burial. Now then, Isaiah gives us the reason for all of this. Because thou hast destroyed thy land. How did he destroy the land?
Tore down the crops. Where it already described it'd be like a barren land, rocks, nothing to be built.
Well, he caused resentment against him by going around conquering everybody and making everybody's life a wreck. Finally, when payday comes, just like Christ said, those that take up the sword shall perish by the sword. So he ended up paying for all his misery he gave everybody.
Yeah, but how did he destroy the land though? Yes, I agree. He's going to pay for what he did, but how did he destroy the land? That's the question. Well, it's probably in a figurative sense that he oppressed the land with wars. And even during those days, the battles that would take place, the land would be to a certain extent destroyed. And also with tyranny.
He took a lot of people, drafted a lot of people, and destroyed, broke up families with people losing their son, fighting his covetous wars for him to get all this, all this stuff he's getting from the war. They're dying, losing their loved ones. That's part of it. That's not the physical land. Still, he's hurting families. They own property. That hurt their property. I don't know, that's kind of carrying too far. I don't know.
Well, you have to remember, during that time frame, the men always went out to battle. I mean, that was a customary thing. And at least on a yearly basis, they would go fight. So that would not be anything that would be unusual. But yes, it would be an oppression of the land, the tyranny that he would demonstrate in relationship to the people that he conquered. So he was hated by the world, by the people. The Babylonian Empire ended with whom? What king? No.
Starts with a B, Belshazzar.
Okay. Belshazzar. And Belshazzar's, it says the seed of the evildoer. Well, it's talking about Belshazzar and his children, his seed. He would have no seed or descendants, or if he did, they died early. There would not be a continuation of his kingdom because he had been defeated in battle, destroyed. Thus, the seed of the evildoer shall never be renowned. And that's the idea of glorified. They won't be king because that dynasty has been ended. Now, the one who defeated them, you said Cyrus, that's the one who defeated the Babylonians. So, verse 21 now, and going through verse 23 is our next section. I titled this The Extent of Babylon's Destruction. And so in verse 21, he tells them, prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquity of their fathers, that they do not rise, nor possess the land, nor fill the face of the world with cities. Babylon was a very prosperous nation. They took all of the riches of all of the nations. They remember Daniel's dream. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. Well, why did he use gold? Because it represented the riches of Babylon. They were rich. But the posterity of the Babylonians were going to be cut off. Their desire for world conquest that Nebuchadnezzar had demonstrated, in particular in defeating all the nations, that's going to be terminated. Pulpit commentary in regards to this, wrote, Belshazzar had wives and concubines, Daniel 5, verse 2, and therefore probably children. The magnanimity of Cyrus may have spared them, but neither Cambyses nor Darius Histippus had the same merciful disposition. As soon as there was seen to be danger of Babylon revolting, they would almost certainly be put to death. So basically, they are stating that here's Cyrus, he takes Babylon. He is deposed by his nature to be generous to them. But those who came after Cyrus were not that way. They were cruel, harsh, hateful, and any sign of any rebellion would have been, they would have put all of them to death, just destroyed them all. So when it says prepare slaughter for his children, you see that that's the result. Any revolt, any type of getting out of line, destroy them. There's a principle that I wanted to discuss in regards to this, and that is specifically in relationship to sin. And this isn't talking about sin, obviously, but there's the principle that we see involved in it. That children suffer the consequences of sin. Someone turn over to Exodus, the 20th chapter, and read verse 5 for us. Exodus 20 and verse 5. And this is, by the way, if you don't recognize Exodus 20, that's the Ten Commandments being given. So now then, someone read verse 5.
Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve him, for the Lord thy God am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me.
Okay. How do we understand visiting the iniquity? What's iniquity? Somebody whispered sin. That's right. Doesn't mean sin, but that's the application of it. So visiting the iniquity or the sin of the fathers upon the children into the third and fourth generation. Does that mean that those children inherited the sin of their parents? They suffered the consequences of those sins, but they did not suffer the guilt of the sin.
Equate that to a mother that's pregnant, smokes drugs, her child could suffer the consequences.
Okay, many children today are born drug addicts because the mother took drugs while she was pregnant. The child is suffering the consequences of the mother's sin in that situation. Here, God says the children, even to the third and fourth generation, are going to suffer not the guilt of the sin, but the consequences of the sin of their ancestors.
We're all suffering from the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin.
Okay, that's what Romans, the 5th chapter, verses 12 and following is talking about. And here's Adam and Eve's sin. How many of us today have access to the tree of life? From a physical standpoint, spiritual standpoint, we do. But from a physical standpoint, how many of us have access to it? If you do, I want you to tell me where it is, because I think I'd like some of that. But
That's that fountain of youth everybody used to look for.
that's that fountain of youth everyone used to look for. That's right. Why don't we have access to it?
Consequences of Adam's sin.
Okay, because of Adam and Eve's sin. And because of that sin, what happened? They were cast out of the garden, and God placed a seraphim there so that they could not get to the tree of life. Thus, we don't have access to it. We die physically as a result of the consequences of Adam's sin. I don't know how many generations that was. I know Nancy and Deborah and Denise are into genealogies. Does your genealogy go back that far? If you make it up. Obviously, and I'm trying to be a little bit facetious in this, but everyone has suffered from that time the consequences of those sins. Have we inherited the guilt of those sins, though? Am I guilty of the sin of Adam and Eve? No. Now then, Calvinism came along and began teaching that we are guilty of the consequences, or are guilty because of what Adam and Eve did. And thus, they referred to it as Adamic sin. By the way, sometime if you ever do a study of total depravity, there's different views of total depravity. Some of them hold that Adamic sin. Some believe that it changed our nature. Thus, the New International Perversion translated flesh as sinful nature many times. So that was another aspect of it. While they might not hold specifically inherited sin, yet because of that sin nature, we all have sin when we're born. But because it changed our nature. So there's different aspects of it. But it's all false. Whichever one you take, it's false. We're born innocent and pure, but yet we're still suffering the consequences of the sins of others. That is simply a obvious statement, or should be. How many people die because someone else was driving drunk? Were they drunk when they were driving? No. Were they obeying the laws? They might have been, hopefully so. And yet, someone else runs into them and kills them. They're not guilty of the sin, but they're suffering the consequences of that person's sin. So we all understand that in principle. But yet, when it comes to the aspect of the conception and birth of a baby, some people say, oh no, they also suffer the guilt of the sin of Adam and Eve. And I've always wondered, and I don't really know how they answer this in relationship, for example, to John the Baptist. Because his parents, both his father and his mother, were righteous before God. If they inherit that, why didn't they inherit the righteousness instead of inherit sin? because it says that they were righteous. And they always have difficulty in explaining Christ. But we are born innocent. We have that period of time in which we are not accountable for our actions because we have not reached that age of, and I'll use a term another individual did once, of discernment, where we can discern right from wrong. When we can discern right from wrong, then we become accountable for the actions that we take. And we commit sin, and thus need a Savior.
And that's why the Catholics had to come up with immaculate conception. Jesus been the exception to the born in iniquity and total heredity.
Yes, because of the doctrine of total depravity, they had to find some way to have Jesus excluded from that total depravity so that he could be our Savior. And so one of the ways in which they did it, the Catholics did it, is the Immaculate Conception, in which Jesus was conceived without sin, and that Mary was without sin, which led to another type of view that inherited sin came from the Father. So it's all our fault. Women had nothing to do with that inherited sin aspect.
I don't think they prayed to Joseph. They do pray to Mary.
That would be true. They didn't pray to Joseph. They did pray to Mary.
So they followed him.
Yeah. That was a way to try and escape the problem, because Jesus did not have the seed of man. It was only the seed of woman, and you inherit the sin from man, not from woman. So they claimed. Again, I still wonder why, if a person is righteous, or if a man is righteous, why isn't his child righteous? Just never has made sense to me. And as I say, I don't know how they answer that, really. Except to start taking a different view of total depravity in relationship to it. Well, it changes our nature so that we are born in sin. But there's the distinction, suffering the consequences as opposed to suffering the guilt of sin. Here he's talking about the children, going to prepare slaughter for the children for the iniquity of their fathers. He's talking about suffering the consequences of what their fathers had done. And as a result, the Babylonians would not rise nor possess the land again. And they would cease to exist as a nation. After Cyrus defeats the Babylonians, what happened to the Babylonian Empire? Do you ever read of it again in the scriptures? It's destroyed. It ceased to exist.
Well, in fact, it's hard to find it. It's so buried in the sand.
Well, except for the excavations in that area, it was buried. It just totally destroyed. But as a nation, you look at other nations, they've been destroyed, but they continued as a nation. But not the Babylonians. They ceased to exist. verse 22 then, for I will rise up against them, saith Yahweh of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant and son and nephew, saith Yahweh. It is God, it's Yahweh, or Jehovah, that is bringing this judgment. It's going to be by the hands of the Medo-Persian Empire. And he's going to state that. He has stated that already. He's going to state it again later on. But he's the one who's bringing this destruction on Babylon. I think there's a good contrast that we can see here. Cut off from Babylon the name, remnant, son, nephew. But notice the name in particular and contrast that. First, turn over to Isaiah 56 and verse 5. And this is more of a prophetic aspect dealing with the church in particular. And he says, even to them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Here's going to be the cutting off of Babylon's name, but then later on here in Isaiah 56:5, Isaiah is prophesying about the church in particular, and it's going to be an everlasting name. Also, and because we might come back to that in a second, but turn back to Ruth, chapter 4 and verse 5. And hopefully everybody remembers the story of Ruth, that account, and how that Ruth had lost her husband. She comes back, or she comes with her mother-in-law to the land of Canaan. She goes to start eating the leftover portions from Boaz's field, and he's kind to her. And finally, he's going to take her to raise up seed from her, or of her, for her husband and that family. And Boaz, who is doing this, in Ruth 4 and verse 5, Boaz says, what day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must also buy it, or thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. This is basically the Levirate marriage law that he's dealing with. And you buy the field, you also have to take Ruth as your wife and raise up children of Ruth. Now then he says, I can't do that, and so it passes on to Boaz, and he does. But here was God's way of making sure that that name in Israel was preserved. Here's Naomi. She has 2 sons. They both die. That name would have ceased in Israel. So God's plan, the next of kin, take that woman, in this case Ruth, and raise up seed so the name does not cease, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. So God had made a way for the name to be preserved in Israel. The church has been given an everlasting name. That everlasting name would be the church, and called many things: the kingdom, the body of Christ, and other terms associated with it. We as Christians have been given a name that is above every name. That's the name of Christian, because it comes from Christ, who is above every name. And thus, we're told if we suffer as a Christian, we should not be ashamed, but glorify God on this behalf, in this name. But in relationship to Babylon here, it would become extinct. The dynasty would cease to exist with no remnant left. So, Lord willing, we'll begin with verse 23 next week.